Hi everyone, Nemo here. Welcome to the Nemo & Co. Conference Halftime Show. Thanks all for joining us. We've just finished General Conference for April 2021 with the Sunday afternoon session. And joining me today is Peter Bleakley, someone that I've collaborated with before and who is also a commentator on all things Mormon. So I'm going to introduce him to you now. Peter, hello.
Hi, I'm Peter Bleakley. I do the podcast, I'm calling it now Mormon Civil War. And I thought there was quite a bit of Mormon Civil War going on in this conference. So very appropriate. And soon to go live on podcast streaming services, but at the moment on a YouTube channel. And Christians versus Pharisees, choosing sides and how to fight for them in the Mormon Civil War. So this was a great conference for me. Lots of food for thought.
Yes, lots of Pharisaical stuff, lots of infighting, it seems. Lots of Christian stuff.
Here and there.
I know we're going to look at the Sunday afternoon session, but actually I do want to kind of just talk very briefly about this morning's session as well. Just because I think particularly our prophet said something very interesting. I do have the quote here. I'll read it. It says, he said, "If you have doubts about the validity of the restoration or the veracity of Joseph Smith's divine calling as a prophet, choose to believe and stay faithful. Take your questions to the Lord and to other faithful sources. Study with a desire to believe rather than with the hope that you can find a flaw in the fabric of a prophet's life or a discrepancy in the scriptures. Stop increasing your doubts by rehearsing them with other doubters. Allow the Lord to lead you on your journey of spiritual discovery." Now, apart from feeling kind of personally called out, as we are indeed...
let's discuss our doubts with other doubters, Nemo.
What do you make of that?
I think it really hit me because in my podcast, I've been really analysing in depth some talks that Dallin Oaks and Russell Nelson gave in 1985 to the church education system. And in it, they're really hammering home this idea that to the whole, in a sense, academic world of Mormonism, who they employ, that they just say we should be biased. It is our job to present propaganda, a one-sided view of everything. And one of the things they're really specific about, and Nelson was in his talk in 1985, was that if you destroy your heroes by mentioning their faults and their flaws, they stop being effective as role models, which is complete nonsense. And he even said himself, if these authors said that the reason we're talking about their flaws is to show that despite flaws, you can still become a great person, I'd take it seriously. But they don't, he said, and everyone else in the world is like, yes, they do. That is the entire point. You can't understand any hero or leader unless you understand their mistakes and what they learned from, and how that played into events. He lives in this very odd world which isn't real. And I think he's not a historian. He's a surgeon. He's a mechanic in a sense of the body. He can do skillful things with a machine, but he's not a thinker. And he can't even get like that. It's useful to know about a hero's journey in order to understand how they became a hero and thus be able to follow their example and be inspired by them. So that just rang a bell. It's the same idea from 1985. And the reason that really struck me is I was 14 in 1985. That was the year I started seminary, and they just told all my teachers they could lie to me. So I'm quite angry about this theme at the moment. It's very personal to me. But that's it, isn't it? It's just and I've seen the Book of Mormon musical. A Mormon just believes.
Yes, indeed.
I could hear the soundtrack in my head. It was hysterical. Yeah.
It's the bit that gets me is the study with a desire to believe. It's like just cognitively preload yourself in such a way that it's like Kerry Milstein said. He said, everything I address from within the paradigm that the Book of Mormon and revealed scripture is already true. Well, then you're not going to get an unbiased view.
And this was a theme that several speakers in this conference addressed, because they're aware they're losing people because they're going and naturally researching with an open mind. And they keep presenting it as this extreme black and white choice. Either you are faithful and are going to believe the right stuff, or you're a hostile skeptic.
Mm.
and they can't imagine that there's a central way to be.
No.
They don't understand that you could just be objective, that you could just approach the world, evaluate it all, think intelligently about it, and just take things as they are and find the good in them. I mean, Jesus told us to do this. Other people have told us to do this. Prove all things and then hold fast to that which is good. They're saying, assume it's all good.
Yeah.
And if nothing happens to prove it's good to you, wait till you die, then God will tell you it's good.
Yeah.
It's not realistic. It's so
No.
in the age of information, this is totally unrealistic
And
advice.
I think you've hit on a really good point there about how I feel like they're starting to notice that people are leaving. I think maybe it has finally made its way up into their ivory tower that this isn't working anymore for people, especially people my age particularly. It just isn't working. And so a lot of people online have been saying it kind of reeks of desperation. I'm not sure desperation is quite the right word, but definitely there's some underlying panic there, it seems. Of, stop doubting, it's all fine, don't worry about it.
Which has been going on for a while, but what was different with this conference, and it is a game changer, is particularly in yesterday's sessions, the Saturday ones, they brought up this thing that more than half of the active members of the church are single, either never married, divorced, or widowed. And they admitted that they've known this has been the case globally for the church since 1992. And it's much more recently that the American membership kind of tipped across that threshold. But as I've been saying in my podcast, half the women in the church are already set up to never marry in the temple. There's 100 men for every 70 women. Easily 20% or the 20 of the men are, you shouldn't marry and they're dangerous, so don't. So you got immediately half the women have a chance of matching up with all the available worthy men and marrying in the temple. They then give them a model of marrying young and having babies almost straight away. And reproduction has come back in as a theme, with Anderson's horrific talk blaming women for unwanted pregnancies and forbidding abortion, and bringing back the idea that teenage mums should be handing their babies over to infertile, righteous couples. So this whole thing is on their minds because the birth rates are falling, and they've said they're concerned about this. It is an issue for them.
Yeah.
And so it's all kind of coming back to old school, make them breed to build the church.
It seems like the last bastion of restoring the church membership is to increase the birth rate.
But if you push people to marry young while they're still poor, if they're at university to just get on with babies, that nearly always disadvantages women. They stop doing their course and have the babies, and they're far more likely to get divorced later. People who marry young and have children young, the pressures are incredible. And of course it plays out. Most of them are going to get divorced. So they're not even offering a healthy
I got married very young.
You're doomed. I'm sorry. Just enjoy it while it still lasts, Dougie.
Will do.
But don't have babies. Don't make it worse. No, you should have babies. They'll be really cute. But so acknowledging that for the first time, saying to the whole church, in effect, we've got to stop our rhetoric that only talks about heterosexual married nuclear couples with babies going to the temple. That they've realized that this massively alienates a lot of single members of my family. This has been the big issue. They've lost interest because there's no place for them in what they talk about. And lots of friends of mine, so they've obviously done the data crunching and realized it's these single people particularly are leaving first, because the model they offer of your path to exaltation and self well-being doesn't involve your life or anything about it, and no one wants to be constantly told they're second-class citizens and not good enough. Absolutely. So this is amazing. So yes, this is a paradigm shift in this conference. To reveal the data they've known all along. How useful would it have been for every ward, every stake, every bishopric to just know, to kind of be given that data, to have transparency about our own data so that we know we've got an issue that more than half of our members is, well, you should be able to see it, but it doesn't kind of register in the consciousness. And that we need to be proactive about providing a healthy, positive way to frame single people's spiritual journeys in our church. There have been a few small attempts at it over the years, but this is saying now we've got to change our whole game plan here, which was remarkable. So that was a real positive coming out of this conference.
And then we get to the afternoon session of today's conference. And we are greeted out of the gates by something that then does proceed to alienate quite a lot of members, which is a lecture on the Constitution. Which, you know, straight away, particularly because he said that there are 3 countries in the world that do not have a codified or written constitution.
So this is Dan and Oaks,
Those 3, this is Dan and Oaks' talk. So those 3 are New Zealand, Israel, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, as a citizen of the latter, I then particularly just feel like, right, okay,
I've taught politics at high school. Let's go.
I took politics at A level, so we are well informed to talk about this. But I don't want to get too dragged into the weeds of the politics because it felt particularly irrelevant. I'm not sure what we were meant to get from this message, other than the US Constitution is divinely inspired, but let's not talk about the multiple amendments that happened to it. Just in the same way that the Book of Mormon was divinely inspired, but let's not talk about the major theological revisions, right? It's that same sort of thing. So what were your thoughts?
I shall Mormon-splain this to you, Nemo. Okay. So first of all, this is something he mentioned in his racism and other concerns talk at BYU last autumn. And he got into it, and in it he knows that the American Constitution has got a rocky history and is really messed up. He knows that it enshrined slavery from the start, and he mentioned it. So this is why he has these caveats that it was kind of a working document in progress. It's this American centrism and exceptionalism has just been driving us in Britain and most of the world nuts. The first thing I was cynical about in my life was like this American jingoism in the church. It's an international church, as someone's just commented. It's a global church. There are more of us outside the USA than in it. And all the time he goes on like this, as if they're in the Holy Land and we're not, is ludicrous. And when we watch the absolute pantomime of insanity that American government and politics often is, the gridlock in their system. He was talking about the separation of powers between the states and so on. Just there's nothing. It's a joke, but it's also wrong. I mean, he did mention the Magna Carta. Thanks, Stalin. Could that possibly be our written constitution that we've had since the Middle Ages? Oh, I think it might be. Mr. I'm an expert at being a constitutional lawyer. The one from 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
That one, which is what all the international laws and systems are based on. It wasn't your invention, little newbies in America. They modelled it on the British system, actually.
We've been doing this for 1,000 years.
Yeah, and the medieval common laws, including habeas corpus and all these things that are enshrined in the Magna Carta. So he's factually inaccurate. And he threw in that only America could have hosted the Restoration. Well, America killed your prophet. Joseph Smith probably would not have been murdered in Britain. We don't kill our religious fanatics. We just don't.
I mean, we used to back in the day. We're past
the Mormons,
that now.
Much before the 1800s, I should add. But the Mormons had to flee America. They had to literally hightail it out of the United States of America to Mexico to function.
As it was at the time, yes.
So this whole thing that the Constitution of America, which had enabled 5 million or however many slaves throughout the first several decades of our church's history, was this safety and protection for the church is nonsense. Obviously, some of it is based on the Book of Mormon. I think you can do a different reading of the Book of Mormon. Haiti, the slaves revolted quite early on in the 1700s and overthrew their masters. Why not interpret the liberation and freedom coming to the Americas, starting with the black people in Haiti? The whole story of Canada, like, hello, Canada, Britain. We got rid of slavery in 1830, the year the church was organized. Canada did not have slaves. They were doing better with their constitution. And all of the story of Central and South America and the Caribbean, they've all got their journey of liberation. So I think there's a much bigger story that can be read into the prophecies in the Book of Mormon. So that just pushes my button. But
I just want to bring you to
sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was going to bring you to a point about he talks about autocratic ambitions and how the Constitution stops those. But there are theocratic ambitions, it seems, in the leaders of the church. And he talks about checks and balances and how brilliant that is in the Constitution, how that's divinely inspired. Where are the checks and balances in the church? If the church is divinely inspired in the same way the Constitution is, where are their checks and balances? Where is their division of power? Where is their common consent? Go. And
in the Doctrine and Covenants, and we're not doing it. Simple as. And it's fascinating because the Book of Mormon, you could say, establishes as a religious concept democracy. You've got this incredible story of the journey that kind of continues the journey in the Old Testament, but then goes further, of experimenting with kings and then judges and moving towards a democratic system and saying this is better. For the reasons that he gave, that you can't be judged for your life and sins if you don't have freedom to choose your own life and sins. So the freedom is essential to our religious journey to have freedom of choice. But then we have, politically, the Book of Mormon says democracy and separation of powers and laws separate from leaders that are objective. The Doctrine and Covenants does the same with the church. We've grown up with this message from leaders that the church is a theocracy. There can be no loyal opposition, as we've discussed before, and so on from the same speaker. But it's in there. The Doctrine and Covenants is incredible. Now, there was confusion about who Joseph thought would lead the church. Was it going to be his son? And that's where the reorganized church went with that one. Is it going to be Sidney Rigdon? Is it whatever? And eventually, Brigham Young created a dictatorship of the 15 apostles,
a theocrat
supporters, because that was his power base. He was the senior apostle in that quorum, so he made it the rulers. But the Doctrine and Covenants says in section 107, I think it is, that there are several leadership quorums in the church of equal authority. The first presidency, the quorum of 12 apostles, the first quorum of 70, and the stake high councils. And at the time they had like 2 or 3 stakes going on, and they were real centers of power, a bit like we read in the book of Acts, where where Paul, as a traveling apostle, respected the wisdom of the local leaders who would pray about where he should go next. And that's kind of how the early church imagined our stake leaders. And they can discipline each other, they can fire each other if they have to. The first presidency is not the supreme authority in our written constitution in the Doctrine and Covenants. And then all of that has then the democratic thing that everything has to be then presented, discussed with, and voted on by the entire membership of the church as a common consent vote. And the church's own manuals teach this. The Institute Manual for Doctrine and Covenants says that not just leadership, but any major policy or doctrinal decision that impacts the lives of the members should be subject to a common consent vote, which we haven't done this since 1978.
No,
that was the last one.
I mean, even in this latest conference, 77 70s were called and sustained at a leadership meeting on Thursday, the 1st of April. And then it was kind of given to the membership. Oh, by the way, we've done this already. So if you could just pop your hands up and let us know that you're cool with it, that's great. And he said, if you have any issues, go to your state president. So again, there's this idea that we can't get past that middleman.
I think it's Doctrine and Covenants 2065. I may have got the verse wrong, but there's a verse that basically says no one should serve in any calling on our church without first being sustained by common consent. But we don't do it with our first presidency and some of the apostles. No. They appoint themselves in secret, then have a press conference. And in President Nelson's case, it was 3 months before we had a general conference at which people were then invited to vote, including the first quorum of 70. So, we are not practicing this. And he said, that we must be governed by law, not individuals. the irony is just lost on them.
Clearly.
Because they have made our church a church that's not governed by its own constitution in the Doctrine and Covenants, that's not governed by its laws, but is a dictatorship of individuals now.
Absolutely.
Them, the 12, the 15. So that was amazing. You know, it was fascinating.
Quite the talk.
But let's hope it creates some discussion, because he's put it on the agenda now. You know, we can talk about this now. And then he also another comment. Sorry, he just said, and there's a suppression of unpopular speech. I'm going to get a T-shirt made. I'm sending that to my stake president.
Yeah. Send one my way.
We're not allowed to have suppression of unpopular speech. That's unconstitutional. That's evil.
So what we need to do is we need to reinstate anyone that was excommunicated for apostasy for what they said.
Unpopular.
Yeah. So Sam Pinson, you're back in. Sam Young, you're back in. Jeremy Runnels, feel free to come back. September 6th, in you come. Should we go on to Elder Razban's talk?
Yeah.
Should we have a crack at that? Yeah.
I just think on Oates, though, sorry. Because we're British, we're not getting the big point. His main point was to say to all these people who want to storm the Capitol, or that in Utah, in American Mormon culture, we know, because we have friends there who just cry about this all the time. They get taught at church by some of their bishops that if you vote Democrat, you're an enemy of the church and you're a servant of Satan. So that's what Elder Oates was also addressing in this talk. He was saying you can change party. You can, in a healthy democracy, sometimes you vote for the other ones and you don't have to agree with their entire program. So there are a lot of Mormons who held their nose and voted for Trump because they're opposed to abortion, for example. But he's saying you don't have to go that far just because that you have concerns about the abortion issue, as one example. You know, vote sensibly for decent leaders, because I think he's been a bit horrified. And I think he used to be a registered Democrat. So he started off more of a liberal. I don't know if he is now. Someone's reported on that. But yeah, there you go. Razband. Right. There you go.
But, a nice message there. Razband and his miracles of the United States power grid. So you know, it's quite brilliant, really, because after our conversation about Fiji and Cyclone Winston and the tens of thousands of people left homeless, what do we have again? We have another miracle where a meeting goes ahead as scheduled. Tell me what you thought of Elder Razband's.
Well, we got the earlier example of, is it him? I think it was Nelson was talking about himself. President Nelson talked about the same thing, where he was saying, we did our tour in Tonga, Fiji, and Samoa, and it was all rainy weather everywhere. So the members were praying for it not to rain during our meeting. It worked in Fiji. It worked in Samoa. Tonga, it just poured. And these poor people came 2 hours early and then had a 2-hour meeting in the rain. But it was also a miracle because they endured and were faithful through the rain. So either way, and this is something that we'll get to, that is a big theme in this talk, is in this conference, is just any which way. It's all about just reframe your expectations. That's how everything becomes a miracle. But his miraculous face-to-face event.
Absolutely, it was
a miracle. And he said some say it's sheer luck miracles. Well, objectively, yes. You know, some people die, some people live.
Because he said the magnitude does not distinguish a miracle as long as it comes from God. That's what he said.
That's nice.
So anything you can attribute to God, you can call a miracle. Yeah. Does that not dilute the significance of miracles somewhat?
What's the difference?
Yeah.
You know, if your prayer, if your wish comes true, it's a miracle. If it doesn't come true and you somehow stay faithful, it's still a miracle. God comforts you when grief and everyone. I mean, there was a lot of dying. You know, we had another General Conference death march today. Yeah. I mean, there wasn't a talk in which someone didn't die for several hours. And we do have to kind of look at these tropes that keep coming up in General Conference. I loved your conversation. Was it with Lewis? Yes. Yeah. Yesterday, where he's just coming cold. He's never seen it before. And he's just saying there's this kind of very limited. He was basically saying there's no meat here.
Yeah.
There's this very limited sort of shallow dance of voice and tone and storytelling of little tiny moments here and there, to kind of, he clocked straight away what our normal Mormon conference shtick is. And this is one of them, to somehow make their stories exciting from their apparently incredibly boring and uneventful lives in Utah. All you've got is your friend died, and then your mum died, and then your kids died, and coping with grief. And what has also been quite a positive, I think, in this conference, is we've had people talking about the Haitian genocide and standing there with their families under threat from gunmen, like real suffering, real developing world's normal life suffering that got a voice for once in our general conference. And it just makes the miracle of the generator and the miracle of the horse that found its way home, that is the level that these Utah general authorities live at, just so trivial.
Yeah.
And almost insulting, actually, to call these things divine interventions.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about God intervening and helping a generator turn, or a generator work, or the power grid go back on to allow a conference to happen. But in a previous session, Renland's saying that it is unfair that millions were killed in the Rwandan genocide with garden tools and horrendous. It was just horrible, absolutely horrifying what happened in Rwanda. But that's unfair, and we can promise people peace in the next life, that they'll see their loved ones again. But God does decide to bring a generator online so we can have a broadcast.
Stop the rain for a meeting.
Or stop the rain for a meeting. It's horrendous. It upsets me. It really does, because it trivializes such horrific issues in place of such menial things.
And as some people are commenting, actually, in the thread, if everything is a miracle, nothing is.
Yeah, exactly.
If everyone's super, no one will be. The God of Lost Keys from Doug,
Yeah.
And I guess meetings are important to businessmen. Well, that's it, isn't it? This is their world, and it is so limited that, not Hubie Brown. I'm losing my mind now. The academic at BYU will come back to me. Hugh Nibley. Hughes. He just warned that when lawyers and businessmen take over the church, this is what we're going to get. It's happened. Yeah,
and he also said that peace is a miracle. Peace is a miracle. Peace is neuroscience. It is the absence of negative emotions like fear and anxiety. That's all it is. It's a state of mind. It's something we can engender without. I mean, you can argue from the Mormon perspective that true peace, lasting peace that comes through Christ. But that's, again, not particularly miraculous. It's a promised thing that will happen if you live up to what Christ has asked you to do. And then he had the audacity to say that he hears and answers every prayer. Oh, no, sorry, that's the next talk. I'll come back to that. Sorry. That leads us on, actually.
Well.
Timothy J. Dykes, because this leads quite naturally on. He goes straight in with another light-based miracle. Which seems to be, you were talking about tropes and threads, that seems to have come through. He talks about, choices without the Holy Ghost lead us to darkness. And so we have to check every day that we are, I think it was just overall quite a milquetoast talk, to be honest.
It's quite bland. Thoughts? Yeah, the same. I didn't write much down for that. But this was the horse got them home miracle.
Indeed.
It's like, every Western that ever got made has a horse that knows its way home. I mean, I've watched this in John Wayne movies and stuff. Champion the Wonder Horse. The big miracle is the horse which knows its way home, knew its way home.
Yes, and the horse that can see better in the dark than we can spotted a cliff edge and stopped. And let's be honest, I'm not sure it was the whisperings of the Spirit. It was probably someone that's ridden horses for a while going, maybe I should listen to the horse.
Yeah.
I think we can be too eager to, in these menial things, ascribe credit to the Spirit, where possibly it's just our own understanding of things. We need to give ourselves more credit.
Yeah. And I think, and I like, I live my life with a sense of God looking after me. So I say a little thank you prayer when stuff like that happens. I'm getting a bit more cynical as I get older. I think that's fine.
Yeah.
But you can't build a religion on that. You
No.
can't get up at the pulpit in front of millions of people and use that as your massively convincing argument that this is a day of miracles. And something that just really struck me during this conference with all these miracle talks is I grew up in a church that was quite militant about criticizing the rest of Christianity for not having miracles. This narrative that we even have the Holy Spirit, which they backtracked on a bit now, which is good. They're being more inclusive. But very much, the Catholics can't perform miracles. They don't have the priesthood. They don't have God with them. No Catholic prayer is going to result in a miracle. And this is all we've got. But I can turn on the telly any day and I'm watching preachers healing people and so on. I mean, loads of it's a con, obviously, but people go to Lourdes and have a healing.
These mega churches.
And so it's like we're not actually producing the goods that we've claimed. And this, again, I think is another reason for disillusion, why a lot of people get fed up and leave, is because they just see through all this and they're just really disappointed by these leaders who aren't producing the goods. They clearly they can't perform miracles. Bill Reel gave a challenge a few years ago of like a lot of money if you can come up with any example of a Mormon priesthood blessing actually producing a miracle, like putting an arm back on, not something that might have a 50-50 chance anyway, but an actual bona fide miracle, the thing that can't be explained by medical science.
Because the church started with a bona fide miracle. That's the claim. The church started with a vision of God and Jesus Christ, right? Or it depends which account you read, but still, a celestial being visited Joseph Smith in a grove of trees. That is the selling message, essentially, of the church. That is why we are different. It's a miracle. God is back. God,
the stuff in the scriptures, we are doing it.
God is not dead. He still has prophets. We are a restoration of Christ's church. And then they talk about all these miracles that Christ performed. And it was really interesting that they drew parallels. I think it was in Razban's talk. He drew parallels. He said, in the same way that Christ healed the sight of a man, you can see things with a better spiritual eye each day. It's like, well, hang on. We're equivalating genuine, bona fide medical miracles of healing blindness with, you will, be a bit more spiritual tomorrow. That's a miracle too. And it's not. That's not what we were sold as a restoration of.
No. And it's just... And I would say, as like an artist and an art teacher, all of this shows an amazing lack of imagination. Like, just as they've got no imagination for what to do with $100 billion, either to say to everyone, the prophecy of Joseph F. Smith is fulfilled. No one has to pay tithing now. Your idea of, well, let's then make our donations to actual charities that need them rather than buying more shares in Amazon. And your amazing petition that everyone should sign.
Absolutely.
And just to actually address, or to have the imagination to use that money to change the world and heal people. As a teacher, I know I could, if you gave me a classroom of 9-year-olds, 7-year-olds, any primary aged children, and said you've got half an hour to spend $100 billion making radical differences to the world to help the poor, heal the sick, do all the things that Jesus cared about, they would have a plan within 30 minutes. They would not, there would be no second thoughts. It would be obvious what to do. They would have imagination and creativity. They could, this is what we should do. Just give them the money. Just find some primary class anywhere in the world, give them $100 billion. They will save our church from God's wrath. Because at the moment, I'm sure he's royally pissed off about them just not using all this wealth to help anyone, even the church. And just, so it's all this, there's no imagination. So the whole, it's the lawyer business thing. Success as a businessman or a lawyer is deceiving people, is not telling the whole truth, is convincing people of your point of view while withholding information.
And it's certainly dealing within the world of facts and figures and the mundane rather than the imaginative
organization. You are being an amazing business manager, if you keep reshuffling your meeting schedules, tick. If you change the names of some of your workforce, tick. If you rebrand, tick. New logo, new, they do all that, and then they think the job's done. Russell Nelson said, if we change the name to Not Mormon, God will give us unprecedented blessings. And he produced a logo and stopped, and that was kind of it. That was and this is still now all they're offering. Where are these miracles that we're going to pour down from Jesus because we stopped offending him by using the name Mormon? Yeah. Where is it? It isn't. We did 2 international fasts. They didn't work. More people died of COVID. And someone, I think it was the Philippine General Authority, mentioned, the darkness of COVID and grim. And then this light, this voice from the prophet came as a beam of light in this misery and darkness. Let's fast and let's do church at home because we kind of have to anyway. And that was the thing. And that sounded lovely, but it didn't work, did it?
No.
Because the fasting didn't cure anyone. And thousands more people in doing church at home have realized it's much more fun and nicer than doing it at church with other Mormons, and they won't be coming back.
And people will call the vaccine a miracle. Those members that aren't anti-vax, they will call it a miracle.
Are there any?
I'm sure there are somewhere. They will call it a miracle. It has been called a miracle to me on comments on my videos, but realistically, why are we not actually just crediting the amazing work of scientists here in Oxford, in American labs, in labs all over the world? Those are the people that have worked hard to create a solution to this problem.
The founders of our religion, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and others, really went for it with this idea that Mormonism is about gathering knowledge from everyone. They said, even if infidels have truth, let's get the truth from the infidels. And they mentioned philosophers and they mentioned scientists. And they said the job of the elders of the Mormon church is to go and gather that knowledge, go and learn from all these people and bring it in. And I just see that as genius now in the information age, where we've created an artificial intelligence, the internet, the hive mind of all human knowledge. The only way for, in a sense, superstitious religion to survive is to 100% embrace that and just not be defensive. And, the mistake of fundamentalist Christians has been to deny evolution, to deny the age of the earth, to fight everyone about everything and then be proved wrong over and over again. But to just embrace it and to not be afraid of that, and to see God's blessing all of those people with knowledge. And Mormonism is about co-creation. We're involved in the unfolding journey of our human progress and knowledge. The scientists are part of the picture. They are divine beings. They are gods in embryo. It's all good, man. We're all here together. God set up this earth for us to learn this stuff. So let's just not
stop demonizing them.
Yeah, stop demonizing. Stop denying they exist.
Otherizing.
Which brings us to a lot of the
brings us to D. Todd Christopherson, actually, in terms of the otherizing. And I mean, the main stick out for that was, to me, I'm gonna lay it out in a good kind of paragraph or so. He says essentially, the difference between being a good person in the church and a good person outside the church is that it's not good enough to live a covenant compatible life, which is being good outside the church. It must be licensed through obedience. Good intentions aren't good enough. It has to be done because you're being obedient to someone. Good works are only good enough when they're done through obedience, not through good desires or our own intentions. He may be a lawyer. Might be.
It sounds a bit like a lawyer.
It sounds like legalese, doesn't it?
It does.
But he did quote J. Golden Kimball, and that man is my idol, because anyone that says, I may not always stay on the straight and narrow, but I try to cross it as often as I can, is a man after my own heart, I think. So what were your thoughts on Elder Christopherson?
The thing that really struck me, because he is thoughtful, you can see he's earnest, he tries to be sincere in everything he says. In the past I've thought of him as one of our bright hopes, but again, and they can't help themselves, the hypocrisy drives me nuts. He was talking about avoiding dishonest conduct, and I've just been documenting dishonesty after dishonesty by our general authorities, lie after lie after lie, and they're still
basically
doing
what my channel's built on.
Yeah, they did loads of it in this conference. Yeah. So they're standing there condemning dishonest conduct with completely oblivious to their own conducting dishonestly, and this avoid choices that harm or disadvantage others. Avoid choices that harm or disadvantage others. This is the man they wheeled out the day after the November exclusion policy kind of got discovered and went live and viral to justify.
Well, yeah, he said it was done through compassion
to exclude children who are coming to church from being allowed to be baptized or ordained or go to the temple with their peers, and then saying that when they're 18 and adults, they have to move out of their gay parents' house and then beg the First Presidency to let them be baptized.
So didn't they have to disavow their parents' conduct as well?
Yes, and disavow their relationship. Avoid choices that harm or disadvantage others. Most of what these apostles do is choices that harm and disadvantage people. Yeah. And they get up there and they teach these things. And they just can't see themselves. Because they've told each other that anything you think or do is you're ordained apostle now. Anything you think is God's will. It must be. You're infallible, and they demand that we regard them as such. So that's the one. I didn't listen to much else he said, to be honest, because I was just so livid about that. But somewhere else, I think it was President Nelson or someone said a similar thing about our responsibility not to harm other people, particularly. It was Sister the Prime. I'm so bad because I'm trying to be feminist, but yes, Sister Jones. Yeah. Yes, she was talking about how in the church we don't hurt children. It's fundamental that we don't do or say anything to harm children, even in times of stress. And she's talking about domestic violence. Bless her heart, brilliant. Tackle this difficult issue. But again, I just thought going after the children in the November policy, which was the point at which many members of the church, like myself, that's where our testimony started to break, or not our testimony, our trust in these leaders.
Yeah, I think trust
started to break. The trust broke because that's exactly what they were doing. They were lashing out in anger. They were so furious that they hadn't stopped gay marriage becoming legal in the USA. They didn't care about the other countries. That they decided, and Christofferson admitted this in his interview with Otterson, who was English PR guy at the time. They do drag us into some crazy stuff. He was saying that the reason we're doing this is to make clear to the world that we don't approve of gay marriage. It's like as if no one had noticed already.
we hadn't quite picked up on that.
No, we're just going to take our own children and punch them in the face. We're going to say, oh, sing this song about baptism and how you must have the Holy Spirit with you, but you can't be baptized because one of your parents is gay.
Yeah,
but keep coming till you're 18.
Yeah,
and they were lashing out in anger. So again, this just ignoring their own acts, ignoring their own responsibility, where they've institutionally done these things and they're teaching these principles, and they're hypocrites because they keep literally breaking all these rules they're teaching us.
And you know what's brilliant? He was talking about tennis, right? And he was talking about unforced errors. You want to look at a whopper of an unforced error? That is the November policy in a nutshell. The ball was coming towards them. It was an easy return, and they smashed it into the net, into the face of the ball boy. If you want to talk about harming the children. They just, it was like, no one, they didn't need to do that. It benefited no one, but it just alienated so many people.
And they eventually realized this because they had to go through the whole ludicrous U-turn 3.5 years later, pretending it was God's will to reverse it completely. But yeah, so it's just, I found this conference was just really, particularly the first session on Saturday was an absolute case study of two religions. This is my thing that I'm going on about in my podcast. We have Christianity, we're compassionate people. We read the scriptures. Mormons know how to do Christianity. We know we have those values. But then we've also got the literal opposite. Every mistake that the Pharisees made, that there's at least 20 of them. It's a sophisticated outcome when you go authoritarian, when you go controlling, where you micromanage people's behavior in every detail in order to make them good, which is where the Pharisees of Jesus's time were at. You inevitably start to do hypocrisy. You start to do mind control. You start to there's a whole package of behaviors that inevitably come out of that mindset, and that's what we also saw. But there is a rebellion. I got excited because Elder Gong and Elder Uchtdorf are clearly intentionally triangulating against the Nelson Oaks Bednar message of exact obedience to the covenant path and saving yourself through observance of rituals. And they just talked about it's Christ's attributes that save us, not our own. They sounded like born-again Christians. They emphasized the grace message and hope and being patient with your sins rather than constantly judging yourself that you're not good enough. And it was literally like a tennis match. It was Christian talk, Pharisee talk, Christian talk, Pharisee talk. And
at least we have that other side now.
Yes.
At least we're getting some of that.
Yeah. And some people are saying that the manifestation of that is becoming this move to be generically Christian, to erase the uniquely Mormon stuff, which I think is a big mistake because it's not going well for generic Christians.
It's our safety. It's our safety because at the moment we start to contend in the arena with Catholicism, they've got a much older claim to authority than we do. So unless we claim a restoration of an authority they no longer have, if we start to come into their arena, they'll crush us.
But I think we have things we can win with. This is the thing. So, but the problem is the leadership, the actual human beings in power at the moment in our church are businessmen and lawyers. They're not theologians. They're terrible scriptorians. They're just rubbish. They do not.
Well, they just
even
come
know
up
the
and
Bible very
quote
well.
the previous prophet. All of them started their talks by saying how wonderful Nelson was, and they just quoted previous church leaders.
Well, as we've discussed before, in response to the revelation of the church hoarding $100 billion, the presiding bishopric and the first presidency both reference the parable of the talents as justifying that, which means they literally have no clue what Jesus was teaching with the parable of the talents. They think it literally was telling them to invest in the stock market, and they can't do metaphor. So they set the tone. They make the laws in our religion because they're a dictatorship who shouldn't be, and there's no common consent and there's no accountability. So we're at them. So at the moment, the Pharisees are dominant in our religion, and that's why there's a mass exodus. And they can't see that, so they're just going to keep barking up the wrong trees of blaming the members and just saying you have to have faith and stop talking to people who have doubts. That will fix it.
That'll solve it. Solve it all. The global church may offer a solution, though. Should we look at what Elder Walker had to say? I mean, it wasn't a massive talk.
Yeah, I didn't really get much from that. I was trying to get a headphone to work at the time. So fill me in.
The major thing I got from that was the words he said was the work or the hastening of the gospel is progressing at a hastened pace, even in these challenging times. Now,
well, that's rubbish.
That's false. Yes, because convert baptisms are down almost 50% from last year. New children of record births are down by about 30% from last year. And it was
already crashing before COVID. You know, the graphs have been really interesting. That they now release the statistics online, a statistical report, because it's got too embarrassing, so they won't show them in general conference anymore. So lots of people have now been number crunching, and all of it is nosediving. You know, growth in the church has now flatlined and is about to go negative. It probably has already, but they're fiddling.
And I mean, compared to global population growth as well, it's now negative. So I mean, it's just trouble. The church isn't really growing particularly. There are a few things.
There are a few mentions of their new gaslighting narrative on that, which is the real strength of the church is in the testimony and faithfulness of the members. I think President Nelson said that at some point, and a couple of others did. This drives us nuts because in the international church, you know that this religion is microscopically small. There are hardly any of us. There are few people in every several towns in most of the world. We are not an established religion. We are always hanging by a thread. And because they live in their Utah kingdom, where they get to control politics and government and laws that get passed, nothing gets passed there without the church leadership giving it the nod. And they feel so powerful in their little fortress. And Patrick Mason has talked about this model of the fortress church. He's clocked it in his book about imagining how the church can get through the 21st century. They're in this fortress and they think they're so strong. And what frustrates me is even the dissidents there, even the people who are the voices of dissent and concern and reform, think that the church itself is not going to disappear, and they keep saying so. Patrick says it. The church is here Mormonism is here to stay. And so they think they've got a time to do a softly game plan. My state leaders think they've got time to change the church with softly reforms. They're doing amazing things, but there will be no people left in 20 years, so it won't matter. It's not fixing the fundamental problem, which is our theocracy of people who shouldn't be there, who don't know what they're doing.
On an anecdotal point, you look at the town I grew up in. The town I grew up in was a town of 80,000 people, right?
Yeah.
There were 100 people that went to the church in my town. And that was actually made up of membership across a couple of towns. And this is,
and we've been here for
where
2
we're
centuries.
Quite well established. We've been here. We've been here. The oldest purpose-built LDS chapel in the world is here, right? It's in Llanelli in Wales. It's now a supermarket because the church has started to decline here, and I think will continue to do so unless we do something about it. But if you want to know more about that, go listen to Peter's podcast, because he does lay out a very excellent groundwork for what exactly we can do to try and rescue the church. Let's go on to our friend Elder Bednar. Yes, he emphasized the roles of principles in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Fluffy
and he
principles.
he was quoting his friends Oakes and Nelson. And someone commented, doesn't he speak for himself anymore? Is he the one who quotes the prophets the most? And he has definitely shifted to that. But I think the reason is because they have exactly the same worldview. So that gives his what he wants to say massively extra authority. He doesn't need to say it himself anymore. He'll just quote Oakes and Bednar, because they're Oakes and Nelson, because they have the same version of the religion going on. So I think that's worth noting, that he's speaking his thoughts through them, and they reinforce each other, I think. So you have definitely got factions going on among the apostles. So Gong and Uchtdorf are really fighting hard for Christianity and grace. They're just all about rules and ordinances and the covenant path thing.
He even talked about the Lord's authorized servants.
Yes.
Like they've got their tick of approval. They've had their things rubber stamped. All very orderly.
Some people have tried to explain this psychologically with David Bednar. He's one of the few apostles, obviously we're getting a few more international ones coming, who isn't from an old Mormon royal family. Until recently, almost every apostle has been related 3 times over to other general authorities, or through themselves and their spouses. So Bednar is an outsider, and that must give him a bit of insecurity. So he's the one who talks the most about his own authority, in effect, and how we should even observe the apostles in their downtime to know how to live our lives. Like everything, they're just these holy, amazing beings that we should model our lives upon and just believe. He is.
I happen to know that Elder Oakes had a trapeze in his back garden at one point and wears Hawaiian shirts. So do I have to follow suit on that?
Trapeze sounds fun.
It does, doesn't it?
We could work with this, Nemo.
I could get behind that.
But that's the thing. It's all, he's so excited. He's a fanboy who's now become his hero. He's adored authority and leaders, and now he is one. He can't contain his excitement, and that just comes across pretty much every time he speaks. And there are endless anecdotes of where he goes and plays mind games with members, like berating people after conference because they stood up before he stood up and such like. You know, he is owning the power trip role. So of course he talks about authority all the time and authorization. Anyway, what did you find particularly? I mean, there's the principle of non-distraction.
Yes, that was quite interesting. I think this idea of principles, right? It's a way of basically saying that a thing we reckon should happen, but we're not going to tell you exactly how it ought to happen. You make it happen. And then we'll tell you if you're right or wrong.
We'll judge you the heck out of you if you don't do it how we think you should have worked out yourself.
Yeah, and I mean he talks about D&C 89, right? And he talks about it. He says it's given for a principle with promise, and that's his justification of the use of the word principle, right? Because he's trying to equate principles kind of with rules and commandments, it seems. But what's interesting is it also says in that in the verse above that, because that's in verse 2, I believe. In the verse above, it says to be sent greeting, not by commandment or constraint. So the word of wisdom is very much a teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves. That is how that works. But funnily enough, it's now a temporal recommend question. So
not a great
it's not being listened to by the members because the amount of steak that must be consumed in the state of Utah is mind-boggling.
I mean, you know, the word of wisdom. When does anyone get asked in a temporal recommend interview about their meat consumption? It's it's such a classic case of our culture totally ignoring what Americans feel like they can't budge on, you know. So this principle of and this comes to I think it was back in the day. It was either Boyd K. Packer or Bruce R. McConkie, I think, gave a famous speech on the unwritten rules. So basically acknowledging that the expectations he and other general authorities had of our members were not scriptural. There was no objective justification for them. Yet he was insisting that these traditions had to be considered as if they were commandments. So there's a long track record here of this idea of you should just know how to behave. And he kept mentioning grooming, you know, your physical presentation, your haircut.
I mean, he is the man with the straightest parting amongst any of them, right? Immaculate.
So he was quoting Oakes with the principle of non-distraction, lecturing the poor kids doing the sacrament. Nothing in their appearance or behavior should distract from the ordinance. He explained the principle, but wasn't specific about the details. But
then local leaders can be giving rules. It's odd. It's really odd.
It's like either have rules or don't. Stop telling everyone you've got to make up your rules, but they better be the ones we're thinking of in our head but haven't told you.
And this is the man who says when you're teaching a lesson in Sunday school, you shouldn't play the game of guess what's in my head. He has said that. Right, about Sunday school teachers and how to be a good Sunday school teacher. Don't play the game of guess what's in my head. He's playing the game of guess what rule I want you to follow. Which
and
just seems
sincere questions. You'll understand the absolute and eternal truths as you choose to let God prevail. So into this slogan, whatever that even means.
That'll be on fridge magnets.
And then issues become non-issues. And you'll know how to groom yourself, what to read, who to socialize with.
Talk about trivializing.
I know, but that's the thing. These are the eternal truths to him. It just struck me there. There's not much. He did get on again to gospel questions, but which is like actual religion rather than just behaviors. But it's so clear that he's the guy who has taught from the pulpit that your outward appearance is a reflection of your inner spirituality, which is literally the opposite of what Jesus, whose church it's meant to be, taught.
Yes.
And this is the Pharisee religion.
God looketh not upon the outward appearance, but upon the heart. It's
so there's a lot of just repetition in this general conference of the old tropes. And, you know, people keep thinking we've moved on. Every time I discuss these things with, where would I pitch them? Slightly more enlightened leaders. they're always like, but we don't, this isn't the church culture anymore. We've all moved on. We've got better than this. We've learned from the mistakes of the 1970s. No one around me does this. Why are you bringing this up? And it's like, because an apostle just taught it in general conference.
Yeah. I mean, I just spoke with my bishop recently,
and he said, "I can do what I want." This.
Yeah. I just spoke to my bishop recently, and he said, "You can do what you want." In the sense that it's okay to have questions and come to church and talk about these problems and whatnot. I said, but hang on, I'm loyally opposed to some things, and Daniel Nate Jokes himself has said that is not okay, and there's no place for that in the Lord's church. So there is a disconnect between what the good members of the church are trying to allow and trying to do, and what the leaders are teaching us. And I just want to pull on because I'm conscious of time. I just want to pull on a final point on this. He talked about the boats. And in particular, he talked about a boat being firm, steadfast, and immovable. Now, the boat, in the analogy he was talking about in a storm, actually is acting in a supple and dynamic way to stay afloat. It kind of works with the waves, not against them, because a boat will lose against waves. If you want to talk about a boat being firm, steadfast, and immovable, what happens is millions of dollars worth of goods get stuck in the Suez Canal when a boat becomes firm, steadfast, and immovable. Right? That's what happens. So let's not be doing that with boats. We actually need to be supple. We need to be dynamic. We need to be praying for revelation, learning what God wants for us now in this time, not keeping hold of a heritage that we feel the need to drag over from 50 years ago. We need to constantly evolve. So that's all. That's kind of how I'd finish up.
And that's the big, and that's the big idea of Mormonism. That's the religion I was taught as a kid when they were getting it right. That's it. We're on a journey of progression. Whatever we are now is not what we're going to be in 20 years. We need to be hungry for this knowledge, which is why I'm so excited to have discovered these great quotes from our founders, that they had that hunger. They understood it. They got it. I mean, they were nut job, polygamous, crazy people who'd shoot you for marrying a black person, but they were quite good philosophers. And they loved knowledge, and Masonry had taught them that. Freemasonry, they had actually picked up some good stuff from there. This idea of bringing in all this knowledge and seeking it. And that's the true religion. That's what Mormonism is meant to be modeling for the rest of the Christian world, who are still rigid and superstitious and limited. Why are we making all the same mistakes? It's so maddening. And like again, growing up, the criticism of the Catholic Church was they stopped having actual revelation, so they replaced it with declarations by committee, the Council of Nicaea, the creeds.
Athanasius,
what is the family proclamation, according to Daniel Oakes' own description in General Conference of how it was made? Months of deliberation by committee. They literally, and he's saying this is how the church receives revelation.
Yeah, it's crazy. So should we hear what our beloved prophet said? Because he finished up the conference talking about the reopening of temples, and he kind of, I almost felt like I was in one of Boris Johnson's briefings at Downing Street. He was laying out the phased plan of opening returns to temples, which is great. But then he said, but really, it's just down to whether your local government will let you go to temple or not, essentially. So he deferred to local government, which I think is positive. I think that's good.
Yes, good.
And then what did he go on to do?
Well,
yes, he praised the pioneers and their consecrated lives. But what's just happened to the Salt Lake and Manti Temple?
The history of our temples possible. This man got up in April 2019 and gave a press conference, followed up by senior Mormon project managers in December, and told us that the purpose of the renovation of the Salt Lake Temple and the Manti Temple was to make them earthquake-proof and to absolutely preserve the pioneer heritage. They had members of the presiding bishopric saying, we are following Brigham Young's plan for these buildings. They rolled in the restorationists who are saying it's going to feel like you've gone back in time when you walk in. You're going to have a 19th century experience. We're restoring all the original paintwork. And they showed pictures, drafts of how it's going to look. All the murals intact, these amazing murals that they sent missionaries to Paris to study at an amazing time in art when landscape was the height of modern cutting-edge art, on the cusp of Impressionism, and they brought that genius home with them and painted it on our temple. And then they just destroyed it instead. They lied to everyone, and they've gutted the Salt Lake Temple, and they're after the Manti murals. And no explanation of why they lied to us and had all these restoration people lining up talking about how they're going to carefully preserve the paint and the plaster of the murals. So for him to get up then after doing that and literally lying to everyone, lying to all the temple workers, and they've talked about this. They were told in their final briefings, leave the temple, it's going to be safe. You'll come back and find it as you left it with a few modifications. This stuff that your ancestors painted on these walls is safe. All of it gone, gutted. They're remodeling it, and they're changing the rooms to little tiny cinema rooms. And they did this to the Logan Temple. And President Kimball said this was one of his biggest regrets, that he let the building people gut the Logan Temple and fill it up with modern nonsense. They've got no soul. They're not artists. They're not literary. They're not religious. They don't understand history, and they talk about it, but they don't have any sensitivity or connection with it, even though the temple is meant to be all about connecting with our ancestors and honoring them. And we do so much in our church to preserve the records and the artifacts and the legacy of people from the past. But he just destroyed all of that in our flagship temple. It's been empty. I wonder
whether any of those murals, and I might just be getting this from, I'm not sure where I might be getting this from, but I'm not sure whether any of those murals paint a picture of the Native Americans as the sole presents, the sole remains of the Lamanites.
I don't think
whether they have anything like that going on that maybe they're trying to get rid of.
Not particularly. They're always trying to cover up something. Although it's, I think it was Gerrit Gong or someone mentioned the work in Latin America being the children of Lehi. So he's not a Heartlander, and but he doesn't go for the Heartland theory. It's like it's the Latinos are the Nephites. But just the hypocrisy of getting up there and saying and paying tribute to the pioneers for giving us this legacy when he's just destroyed it. Literally, physically. And what does that say? If he can destroy that, he will destroy anything, and he will destroy anyone. And this is the inevitable, it always happens, the next step for dictators, because they are jealous of anything that people love that they did not provide or create
they destroy
themselves.
Symbols of the past.
They destroy symbols of the past. They destroy things that people have as an independent heritage of their own megalomaniac vision, whether it's conscious or not. That's what people given absolute power with no accountability do. And we've just watched it. And as an artist, that's profoundly impacted me. Even though obviously I should care more about all the families they've destroyed and and the people they've driven to suicide with their homophobic and transphobic rhetoric. But this is a sign, that is a moment. And to then, as always, just pretend it didn't happen, take no responsibility, no connection between what they say and what they actually do. And this is what we're trapped with. It's got to stop. We can't have these people running our church off a cliff anymore, because it's not going to survive the next few years. It is incredibly vulnerable. And how interesting, all these extra temples.
But it's okay, because he announced extra temples, 20 new temples.
We can afford
We've got to do something with the money, haven't we?
You can build all the temples in the world to make it look like the church is growing. But we know that the church is collapsing in Europe.
Yeah, why are you building temples?
In Oslo and Vienna. What was the third one? I missed that.
Oslo, so it's Oslo, Brussels, and Vienna.
Brussels? You're kidding me.
So there's already a temple in The Hague. There's a temple in Paris. The Belgian saints, within a couple of hours, can be in one of 2 temples. Sorry for the American audience that maybe aren't so familiar with European geography. But the Belgians don't really need a temple that desperately. The Scottish have to drive further from the tip of Scotland to Preston than a Belgian will have to drive from parts of Belgium to the Hague temple. Right?
Well, you mentioned
so there's no need for one.
Well, the members of the Europe area presidency have rather foolishly told the Scottish saints that they could have a temple if they really want one. Of course, they really want one,
Of course they do.
going nuts. And so they're going nuts for it. They've just had it as a big theme in one of the Scottish state conferences. Someone claims to have been told in a private conversation with one of them that it will happen before their current state presidency's administration ends.
Oh, that sounds very much like the second coming will happen before the end of your lifetime.
But I was thinking, well, that's nuts. But then it's like, well, I did some maths. There are something like 56 major towns in Scotland, something like that. The church could afford to build 10 Salt Lake temples in every Scottish town with $100 billion. They might do it. And we know that there are only about 4,000 members of the church active in Scotland.
Yeah.
Which is one small stake. They'll give them a temple. I mean, that must be what's going on in Oslo and Vienna.
Because Oslo, they're getting one. Vienna, they can get to the Bern, Switzerland temple. They can get to the Frankfurt temple.
But they just aren't the members. It's going to be, I mean, the Rome temple is gorgeous. What a beautiful building. Complete white elephant. There aren't enough members to keep that going.
Yeah.
So it was just a temple splurge gun, wasn't it?
Singapore got one. Which is interesting because I just shared on my Facebook that actually the Chinese government responded to the announcement of the Shanghai temple by saying, that's wishful thinking. It's not happening. So there's that going on. So Singapore might be a good place in Asia to be
nearby.
A couple in Mexico. Then they started to come into America. So you got Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico. Idaho's getting one. Oregon, Nevada, California. And of course, we cannot forget that Utah needs another temple. It just does.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a conference announcement of temples if they don't get one.
And I think it's all clearly a strategy to keep the local members excited. Because I've got family in Utah. They love it when there's a new temple nearby. This is their world because they're living in, frankly, quite boring a lot of the time Utah bubble. So they haven't got genocidal warlords to keep their life interesting. So a temple is like amazeballs. And it's feeding the heartland of faithful their little toys to play with and get excited about, even though they don't need them at all. And they're not functioning at capacity.
It's just a hype machine.
Yeah. But this is what you can do when you've got loads of money but no members. You just spend the money on buildings instead of, we just have to remember the alternative. If they really wanted the church to grow and thrive, they would have a long, hard look at themselves. They would actually listen to the people who've left, the 80% or more of all of our young people who have left. They would listen to them, and those people will tell them exactly what they're getting wrong. And it's nothing to do with anything they taught in General Conference today, except perhaps the acknowledgement that we need to have better rhetoric for our single members, that we need to give them a clear vision for their deeply spiritual, valued and progressive path to exaltation in the celestial kingdom. Although we always have to deal with the elephant in the room, that means eternal polygamy for most of them. That's the solution. But, to try and think about that too much. But, so there's they're just all, it's all avoidance, avoiding the issue, avoiding the real
symptoms. Treat the symptoms.
So the problem is you look at the internet and find out how much we've lied. Don't look at the internet.
Yeah, that's the solution.
And then disconnect make the whole religion about loyalty to them as leaders, not to actual objective truth. And again, this is something that these specific humans, Russell M. Nelson, Dallin Oaks, have been teaching in particularly to the church education system for decades, since the 1980s. They've laid it all out. Some of these talks are in still the pre-service reading manual for seminary teachers. I mean, that manual is incredible. It's really long. There's loads of these talks and snippets of talks, but it gives you every incarnation of Christian or Pharisee Mormonism writ large. It's in the library app. Look up your gospel library app, folks. Teaching in the church. You find it, the pre-service reading manual for the seminary teachers. It's got all the worst and a few of the best talks about mind control. They've laid this all out, that it's to don't let the kids study, don't teach them the real history, even though Ballard said that for a bit, that's what we should be doing. They're backtracking on it big time. And the philosophy is get a spiritual witness, a warm fuzzy that Joseph Smith
doubt
was a
your
prophet.
doubts.
Doubt your doubts, and then you won't have doubts anymore because they'll go away. They'll just disappear.
They won't. The cognitive dissonance will just eat you alive.
Put it on the
until
shelf.
you deal with it.
But the reality, which anyone who's left will tell them, is you start putting things on the shelf, you get 1,000 questions on the shelf, and the shelf breaks.
Yeah.
Or you can't leave all your answers to the next life for when you're dead to be answered, because you've got to have a religion now. And you can't.
What's really funny is Razban spoke about that devotional that was able to go ahead, and it was in that devotional that he told the YSA to put it on the shelf if they're not sure.
Yes, literally.
He used that phrase.
It. Yeah.
He told us to put things on our shelves.
Yeah.
So
last year,
and
people do, and then the shelves break, and they got nothing.
Yeah.
So it's just this terrible, disastrous strategy that hasn't worked for decades. It sort of worked until the internet in the early 1990s, but this cannot work when everyone lives online now. Even the older people, most of them are online. You cannot pretend that this information doesn't exist. And one of the speakers said, all this stuff is just a swipe or a click away. Might have been Gong or someone. It was mentioned that they can instantly access. But all he said, whoever it was that said it, was, but alternatively, you could go to God in prayer for your answers. And I'm like, well, if Wikipedia can tell me the answer straight away with detail, which I know I'm not going to get from a prayer, because you tell us to pray like Joseph Smith, but we know we're not going to get a first vision. God and Jesus are not going to be coming to explain it all to us. So all we've got is warm, vague impressions. And they keep saying, go and pray, which is abdicating their own job. They're meant to be praying to get our answers, but because it's always you do it.
I want to finish up on this point, actually, if I can. I just want to finish up on the point of what prophecy did we see from our prophets, seers, and revelators? Did we see any?
No,
I don't think so.
No.
And so, have you got any final thoughts on that, Peter, as we wrap up tonight?
It can't keep. On the one hand, as I said before, they think they're getting away with it, but then no, they don't, because they know they're not getting away with it. They see the stats, they know none of this is working, but they keep flogging the same thing over and over because they have no imagination for anything different. And the first presidency specifically are ideologically fanatical about never admitting that they or their predecessors were wrong. Although, of course, they're hypocrites, so they will attack their predecessors and throw Hinckley and Monson under the bus for the I'm a Mormon campaign.
Absolutely.
But it's this duality, it's the double think, the Orwellian thing. It's written up. I mean, it's a fascinating study of Orwellian politics and psychology, our general authorities. They're doing it all. But on the whole, the dominant narrative is they will not admit error. And Oakes is particularly adamant about that in his talks, and he is the dominant ideologue among the leadership at the moment. He's bullying everyone else into agreeing with him on the whole. And so they're so rigid. They don't understand, or they don't want to understand, or half their brain understands but it won't talk to the other half, whatever's going on. If they just listened to us, to the people who've left, and I'll just finish with this. I was re-listening to the Renlands face-to-face, this miracle face-to-face they did in the temple set at Goshen, wherever it is. And one of the things he said at the end, he actually got lovely at the end. I warmed to him a little. He was talking about how you've got questions and they deserve answers. Your questions deserve answers, he was saying to these young people. And I was like, yes, they do. Thank you for saying that. And he said, you've got lots of questions. They all deserve answers. The suggestions for getting them, of course, were not very helpful, because he was saying, go and talk to your friends, talk to people who are faithful, not the dissidents or the doubters, and get those answers. And they won't be able to answer them. And this is a theme that came through in this conference as well. Repeated the advice. Go and talk to faithful people. Now, what these general authorities mean by faithful people is people who are still in a McConkie Mormon mindset, who haven't read the Gospel Topics essays, who haven't the first clue, they haven't the first clue about what the issues are that people can find out online. They just don't know. And they definitely don't have answers for it, because even Fair Mormon and the apostles don't have answers. And this craziness of the apostles saying, well, we won't pray and ask you for you. Joseph Smith would, but they won't, for an answer. You go find it yourself. So they're saying to any kid, well, I, as a prophet, seer, and revelator, don't have an answer to this from God, but you go ahead. You go and get a revelation that I can't. And so they won't get an answer. And when they ask people, before long, they'll be told to shut up and that they're being faithless and dangerous and contentious. And why you keep asking these questions? And exactly, it's happened to all of us. And quickly, the culture will turn on them as enemies. Whereas these leaders keep telling people, ask your questions, talk to people, talk to your bishop, talk to your parents. Well, we did. We have. We are. It's a car crash. Because you haven't given them the answers. It's this whole thing, we'll teach you a principle and expect you to sort yourself out. There aren't any, or there are rather. The academics have the answers. The historians have explained it all. Pretty much every question you have about Mormonism and Mormon history, we've got answers. People discuss them at length. There are entire communities online who understand the answers. But the problem is none of them support the Pharisaical religion. As a principle, none of them support rigid authoritarian control freakery as the way to live your spiritual journey. And none of them provide insights into history that make the prophets look infallible. So they can't acknowledge that these answers exist, but they do. I know I've got answers to pretty much everything now. But if I started teaching most of them at church, I would be excommunicated even more rapidly than is probably going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
Because the first step has to always be, our leaders are not infallible. Our ordained prophets, seers, and revelators have made terrible mistakes. They have lied to you repeatedly. They are sinners. Now, we could work with that if they were repentant and honest about it, but they will not repent. They will not admit they have this problem. They will never apologize, or these people won't. They've said they won't. And ongoing. Elder Bednar, who's the next apprentice, he's lined up demographically to be our president for a very long time, at the point where the church will be in free fall collapse, and he will kill it off if he's carrying on as he is. So we can't. The hope for people for reform in our church was always, well, younger people will come through and become the leaders and save us.
It won't make that far.
No, because they become corrupted by absolute power with no accountability by then. They go through decades of conditioning, even if they start out. Dallin Oaks used to be one of the editors of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. He used to be politically a Democrat. He used to be quite woke. But where is he now? Because the system gets to you. And sometimes they describe it. They describe themselves coming as new apostles, and then they realize it's not what they expected. And then they get indoctrinated into this idea that you just stay quiet and the senior apostles do all the talking and thinking. And by the time you work along the velvet thrones to where you're getting the nice chocolates from the box, you've forgotten your real past. You've forgotten the idealism you may have come into that calling with. You have been institutionalized. You've become the next person who's going to be about tradition and not having a vision for the future. So the only hope for us is the system has to break. We have to bring back our constitutional rights, which is in the Doctrine and Covenants, with the balance and separation of power, so that we don't concentrate this power, as Dallin Oaks has taught, ironically, and common consent. And let's just let these people retire. That just making people who are dying slowly run a world religion is cruelty to the elderly. Let them emeritize at 70. They do it to the 70s now, because they've realized you can't have a whole quorum of first 70 where everyone's in their 90s with dementia. But
doesn't work.
But they'll do it with the apostles.
Right. So, with that message ringing in our ears, thank you very much, Peter.
This conference gave us all of that to talk about. Isn't that awesome?
It's
even
brilliant.
The bad stuff. It starts a conversation.
Because when they lie to us, if we speak about it, then it allows us to start to confront these things. But we have to call it out when they lie to us, and that's what we're doing here. So thank you very much for joining me for that. Remind everyone where to find you.
So I have a YouTube channel called Mormon Civil War. It's about to go into podcasts as well. So hopefully in a week or so, it'll be searchable in podcast services. And my specific podcast series at the moment is called Christians versus Pharisees, Choosing Sides and How to Fight for Them in the Mormon Civil War. So I'm kind of laying out in a series that will be kind of limited one, what the major issues are and what we can do about them. And then I'm finishing up soon with what are the great strengths in Mormon theology and culture that we could win the 21st century with. I still have a vision for Mormonism being a world religion. There's no reason for it not to be. If those religions can do it with their frankly quite bizarre beliefs, why can't we?
We can too.
Why not? Be ambitious for ourselves, but we can't do it while we're running things as we've just seen in this conference. It's not going to happen.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, Peter. Make sure everyone go over and check out his channel. Make sure to subscribe to him. And thank you very much from me too. Yeah. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.